chronological narrative of the United States does not begin with a declaration of ideals, but with a corporate charter. On the 10th of April, 1606, King James I of England granted a royal charter to the Virginia Company of London. This document, a business contract intended to generate profit for shareholders through the discovery of gold and a passage to the Orient, provided the legal basis for the first permanent English settlement in North America. 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, landed on the swampy banks of the James River on the 14th of May, 1607. They named the settlement Jamestown. The early years of the Virginia colony were defined by administrative mismanagement and high mortality rates. However, the economic viability of the enterprise was secured not by gold, but by botany. In 1612, a settler named John Rolfe began experimenting with strains of tobacco native to the West Indies. By 1617, tobacco exports to England were substantial, fundamentally altering the colony's purpose from resource extraction to agrarian cultivation. To manage the governance of this growing population, the House of Burgesses convened in a church in Jamestown on the 30th of July, 1619. It was the first representative legislative assembly in the Western Hemisphere, establishing a precedent for local self-rule that would endure for centuries. While the Chesapeake colonies developed around a cash crop economy, a different model of colonization was taking shape in the North. On the 11th of November, 1620, the Mayflower dropped anchor off the coast of Cape Cod. The passengers, a group of religious separatists known as Pilgrims, lacked a royal patent for this specific territory. To prevent legal anarchy upon landing, 41 male passengers signed the Mayflower Compact. This brief document was a social contract, binding the signatories into a civil body politic to enact just and equal laws. It was a pragmatic solution to a jurisdictional problem, yet it laid the groundwork for consensual government. This was followed in 1630 by the arrival of the Arbella, carrying John Winthrop and the initial wave of the Great Puritan Migration. They established the Massachusetts Bay Colony under a royal charter that uniquely allowed the company's headquarters to be located in the colony itself rather than in London. This administrative loophole granted Massachusetts a significant degree of autonomy. The New England economy, driven by the rocky soil and colder climate, focused on timber, fishing, and shipbuilding, creating a diversified commercial infrastructure distinct from the plantation system of the South. Throughout the 17th century, the map of the Atlantic seaboard was filled in through a series of proprietary grants. In 1632, King Charles I granted the province of Maryland to Cecilius Calvert, Lord Baltimore, as a haven for Catholics. In 1664, the English seized New Amsterdam from the Dutch Republic, renaming it New York in honor of the Duke of York. To the south, the Carolinas were charted in 1663, and William Penn received the charter for Pennsylvania in 1681 to settle a debt owed to the crown to his father. The last of the 13 colonies, Georgia, was established in 1732 by James Oglethorpe as a buffer zone against Spanish Florida and a penal colony for debtors. The relationship between these disparate colonies and the crown was governed by the economic theory of mercantilism. Parliament passed a series of navigation acts between 1651 and 1673 to ensure that colonial trade enriched the mother country. These acts required that all goods imported to the colonies be carried on English ships, and that certain enumerated articles like tobacco and sugar be exported only to England. However, enforcement was lax, a policy historically referred to as salutary neglect. This period of administrative leniency allowed the colonial assemblies to gain significant power over local taxation and expenditures. The geopolitical equilibrium was shattered by the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War in 1754. It was a global conflict that manifested in North America as a struggle for control of the Ohio River Valley. The conflict concluded with the Treaty of Paris, signed on the 10th of February, 1763. France ceded its North American territories east of the Mississippi to Great Britain. While this was a military triumph for the British Empire, it created a fiscal crisis. the war had doubled the British national debt. Furthermore, to prevent further conflict with Native American tribes, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and forbade colonial settlement to the west. This bureaucratic restriction on land speculation, combined with the Crown's need to raise revenue to pay for the war, signaled the end of salutary neglect and the beginning of a constitutional crisis that would sever the political ties between London and the American colonies.
The breakdown of the political relationship between Great Britain and its North American colonies was driven primarily by a dispute over fiscal policy and parliamentary sovereignty. Following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the British government, led by Prime Minister George Grenville, sought to alleviate the national debt incurred during the 7 Years' War. The administrative logic was that the colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defense. This necessitated a series of legislative acts that fundamentally altered the imperial status quo. The Sugar Act of 1764 was the first attempt to strictly enforce customs duties, but it was the Stamp Act of 1765 that provoked a coordinated constitutional objection. The Stamp Act required that all legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and almanacs in the colonies carry a tax stamp purchased from government agents. This was a direct tax levied by Parliament, not by the colonial assemblies. The colonial response was grounded in English common law, the principle of no taxation without representation. In October 1765, the Stamp Act Congress convened in New York City, issuing a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Although Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766 due to economic pressure from British merchants, it simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The conflict escalated with the Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed duties on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The administrative enforcement of these acts led to civil unrest, culminating in the Boston Massacre on the 5th of March, 1770. However, a period of relative calm followed until the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. This legislation was designed to bail out the financially struggling British East India Company by granting it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. On the 16th of December 1773, a group of colonists boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and destroyed the cargo. The British response was punitive and bureaucratic. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. These statutes closed the port of Boston, annulled the Massachusetts Charter, and expanded the Quartering Act. In response, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774 to coordinate a boycott of British goods. The situation transitioned from political protest to armed conflict on the 19th of April 1775 when British troops attempted to seize colonial munitions at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, effectively assuming the functions of a national government. They established the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Despite the outbreak of hostilities, many delegates still hoped for reconciliation, sending the Olive Branch Petition to King George III in July 1775. The king refused to receive it and declared the colonies to be in a state of open rebellion. The move toward total separation was catalyzed by the publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, in January 1776, which argued for independence on Republican grounds. On the 2nd of July, the Congress voted for independence, and on the 4th of July, 1776, they ratified the Declaration of Independence. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, this document was a legal indictment of the king, listing 27 specific grievances to justify the dissolution of political bands. The War for Independence was a protracted struggle of attrition. The turning point occurred in October 1777 with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This success convinced the Kingdom of France to formalize a military alliance with the United States in 1778, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict involving Britain, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. The military phase effectively concluded with the siege of Yorktown in Virginia, where General Cornwallis surrendered his army on the 19th of October, 1781. Diplomatic negotiations took place in Paris over the next 2 years. On the 3rd of September, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. In this definitive document, Great Britain formally acknowledged the United States as free, sovereign, and independent states. The treaty established the boundaries of the new nation, north to Canada, south to Florida, and west to the Mississippi River. The colonies had achieved legal sovereignty, but they were now faced with the daunting task of constructing a functional federal apparatus from a loose confederation of states.
Following the Treaty of Paris, the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, a document ratified in 1781 that created a firm league of friendship rather than a unified nation. The central government lacked the power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, or raise an army. It was a legislative body with no executive branch and no judiciary. The weakness of this administrative structure became alarmingly evident during Shays' Rebellion in 1786, when debt-ridden farmers in western Massachusetts rose up against state tax collectors. The inability of the Confederation Congress to respond effectively to this internal disorder signaled the need for a fundamental systemic revision. In May 1787, 55 delegates gathered at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Ostensibly convened to amend the Articles, the delegates, led by James Madison, quickly moved to scrap the existing framework entirely. Over 4 months of secret deliberations, they engineered a new federal apparatus. The conflict between large and small states regarding legislative representation was resolved by the Connecticut Compromise, which established a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate with equal representation for each state. The divisive issue of slavery was addressed through the 3/5 Compromise, a bureaucratic calculation that counted 3/5 of the enslaved population for purposes of taxation and representation. On the 17th of September, 1787, the final draft was signed. However, the document required ratification by 9 of the 13 states. This sparked a fierce public debate between the Federalists, who supported the strong central government, and the Anti-Federalists, who feared executive tyranny. To secure ratification, the Federalists promised the immediate addition of a Bill of Rights. These first 10 amendments to the Constitution, ratified in 1791, explicitly protected individual liberties and reserved undelegated powers to the states. George Washington was inaugurated as the first president on the 30th of April, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York City. His administration established the precedent of the cabinet system. The most significant administrative development of this era was the financial program proposed by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. In 1790, Hamilton successfully argued for the federal assumption of state war debts and the creation of a national bank. The first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791, institutionalizing the concept of implied powers under the Constitution's Necessary and Proper Clause. The authority of the new federal government was physically tested in 1794 during the Whiskey Rebellion, when Washington deployed 13,000 militia troops to western Pennsylvania to enforce a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. The political landscape fractured into the first-party system, Hamilton's Federalists versus Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. The election of 1800 marked the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political factions, an event Jefferson termed the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson's presidency was defined by a massive act of executive land acquisition. In 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. This transaction, known as the Louisiana Purchase, doubled the size of the nation overnight, securing control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. To inventory this vast asset, Jefferson dispatched the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, who conducted a detailed cartographic and botanical survey of the continent from 1804 to 1806. The young republic's sovereignty was challenged again by the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. British practices of impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy and restricting neutral trade led Congress to declare war on Great Britain on the 18th of June, 1812. The War of 1812 was a bureaucratic and military stalemate. The United States suffered the humiliation of having its capital city, Washington, D.C., burned by British troops in August 1814. However, the conflict formally ended with the Treaty of Ghent, signed on the 24th of December 1814. The treaty restored the status quo ante bellum, meaning no territory changed hands. Yet the war solidified American nationalism and marked the end of the Federalist Party, which had opposed the conflict. With the European powers finally at peace, the United States turned its administrative gaze away from the Atlantic and towards the vast, unmapped interior of the continent. The period following the War of 1812 became known as the Era of Good Feelings, a label that masked the intense administrative reorganization of the continent. The primary objective of the federal government shifted to the consolidation of borders and the development of internal infrastructure. In 1819, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain, securing the cession of Florida and defining the boundary between New Spain and the United States territory. This diplomatic clarity allowed for the articulation of a bold foreign policy stance in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. In his 7th annual message to Congress, President James Monroe declared that the American continents were henceforth closed to future colonization by European powers, establishing a sphere of influence that would guide hemispheric relations for a century. However, the geometric expansion of the Republic ignited a fierce legislative debate over the status of slavery in the new territories. When Missouri applied for statehood in 1819, it threatened to upset the precarious balance of power in the Senate between free and slave states. The crisis was temporarily resolved by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, drafted by Henry Clay. This statute admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state while drawing a line at the parallel 36 degrees 30 minutes north. Slavery would be prohibited in all future territories north of this geographic coordinate. It was a bureaucratic demarcation line intended to postpone a moral reckoning. Simultaneously, the physical integration of the interior was accelerated by the transportation revolution. The completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 linked the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean via the Hudson River, slashing the cost of shipping freight and transforming New York City into the commercial capital of the nation. This era also witnessed the rise of mass democracy under Andrew Jackson, elected in 1828. Jacksonian democracy expanded the franchise to nearly all white male citizens regardless of property ownership. Yet this democratization coincided with a systematic policy of dispossession. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the president to negotiate treaties to relocate Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi to federal lands in the West. This policy resulted in the administrative atrocity known as the Trail of Tears, the forced migration of the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations to present-day Oklahoma. By the 1840s, the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the continent, drove national policy. The election of James K. Polk in 1844 signaled an aggressive pursuit of this vision. In 1845, the United States annexed the Republic of Texas, which had declared independence from Mexico nearly a decade earlier. This act, combined with disputes over the Rio Grande border, precipitated the Mexican-American War in 1846. The conflict was a series of military campaigns that culminated in the occupation of Mexico City. It concluded with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on the 2nd of February, 1848. Under the terms of this treaty, Mexico ceded 55% of its territory to the United States, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico and Colorado. This massive acquisition, known as the Mexican Cession, coincided perfectly with the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California in January 1848. triggering the California gold rush and a rapid demographic shift to the Pacific coast. The acquisition of this vast new domain immediately resurrected the sectional crisis. The question was unavoidable. Would the new territories be free or slave? The political system strained under the weight of this issue. In an attempt to preserve the Union, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. This complex package of bills admitted California as a free state, but enacted a stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which compelled federal officials and citizens in free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. It was a legislative attempt to legislate peace, but it only deepened the polarization. The era of compromise was ending. The administrative glue that held the North and South together was drying out, and the friction of expansion was generating enough heat to ignite a civil war. The political cohesion of the United States disintegrated in the autumn of 1860. The election of Abraham Lincoln on the 6th of November, representing the newly formed Republican Party which opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, acted as the catalyst for administrative dissolution. Lincoln won a plurality of the popular vote, but a majority of the Electoral College, despite not appearing on the ballot in 10 southern states. This geographical polarization prompted South Carolina to convene a special convention. On the 20th of December, 1860, the delegates unanimously passed an Ordinance of Secession, repealing the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and declaring the union between South Carolina and the other states dissolved. By February 1861, 6 other states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had followed suit. Representatives from these states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to draft a provisional constitution for the Confederate States of America. This document mirrored the U.S. Constitution, but explicitly protected the institution of slavery and emphasized states' rights. The legal standoff turned violent on the 12th of April, 1861, when Confederate artillery bombarded the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. In response, President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the insurrection, prompting 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to secede. The ensuing conflict was the first modern industrial war, defined as much by logistics and manufacturing capacity as by tactical maneuvers. The Union possessed a distinct material advantage, a larger population, an extensive railroad network, and a dominant industrial base. Lincoln's administration utilized these assets to implement the Anaconda Plan, a strategic blockade of southern ports designed to strangle the Confederate economy by cutting off cotton exports and preventing the importation of war materiel. To manage internal dissent, Lincoln took the controversial step of suspending the writ of habeas corpus in parts of the country, a move challenged by Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney in the case Ex parte Merryman, but ignored by the executive branch on grounds of national emergency. For the first 2 years, the war in the Eastern Theater was a stalemate. However, the political character of the conflict was fundamentally altered on the 1st of January, 1863, with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that all enslaved persons in territory currently in rebellion shall be thenceforward and forever free. While limited in immediate physical effect, it legally transformed the war from a campaign to preserve the Union into a crusade against slavery, effectively preventing European powers like Britain and France from intervening on the side of the Confederacy. The military turning point occurred in July 1863. In the West, Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi on the 4th of July, securing control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Simultaneously, in the East, the Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania halted the Confederate advance into the North. Following these victories, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address on the 19th of November, reinterpreting the purpose of the nation as one dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. By 1864, the Union strategy shifted to total war. General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia was a calculated logistical operation designed to destroy the South's physical and psychological capacity to wage war. Railways were torn up, factories burned, and crops seized. The administrative collapse of the Confederacy was now inevitable. On the 9th of April, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The terms were simple and generous. Officers could keep their sidearms, and men with horses could take them home for the spring planting. The legal abolition of slavery was finalized not by executive order, but constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment, passed by the Senate in April 1864 and the House in January 1865, was ratified in December of that year. However, the architect of this victory did not live to see the peace. On the 14th of April 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The presidency passed to Andrew Johnson, and the exhausted nation faced a new, equally difficult challenge: how to legally and socially reintegrate the defeated states and 4 million newly freed people into the fabric of the republic.
The post-Civil War era began with a constitutional struggle between the executive and legislative branches regarding the legal status of the defeated Confederate states. President Andrew Johnson favored a lenient policy of readmission, but the radical Republicans in Congress insisted on a fundamental restructuring of Southern society. This conflict escalated to a bureaucratic breaking point in 1868 when Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by removing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without Senate approval. This led to Johnson becoming the first president to be impeached by the House of Representatives, though he survived conviction in the Senate by a single vote. Despite this executive paralysis, Congress succeeded in ratifying 3 landmark constitutional amendments. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, ratified in July 1868, defined citizenship to include all persons born or naturalized in the United States, overturning the 1857 Dred Scott decision. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. To enforce these new rights, the federal government established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, known as the Freedmen's Bureau, an administrative agency tasked with providing food, housing, and legal assistance to displaced Southerners. Reconstruction formally ended not with a treaty, but with a political backroom deal known as the Compromise of 1877. Following the disputed presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden, a special electoral commission awarded the presidency to Hayes. In exchange, the federal government agreed to withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South, effectively abandoning the enforcement of civil rights and allowing the Southern states to enact Jim Crow laws that institutionalized segregation. With the political question of the Union settled, the nation's energy turned toward industrial consolidation. The catalyst for this transformation was the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. On the 10th of May, 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads were joined with a ceremonial golden spike. This engineering feat, subsidized by the Pacific Railway Acts of 1862, integrated the national market. To manage the complex logistics of transcontinental travel, the major railroad companies unilaterally divided the continent into 4 standardized time zones on the 18th of November, 1883, a system eventually codified by federal law. The scale of American business expanded dramatically, giving rise to the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe the era's superficial glitter masking deep social problems. Corporate structures evolved to avoid state restrictions on holding companies. In 1882, John D. Rockefeller's lawyers created the Standard Oil Trust, a legal device that allowed a board of trustees to manage the assets of multiple companies across different states. This model of vertical and horizontal integration created vast monopolies in steel, oil, and sugar. In response to public outcry, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, the first federal statute to limit cartels and monopolies, though initially the courts used it primarily against labor unions. The settlement of the West was driven by the Homestead Act of 1862, which granted 160 acres of public land to any settler who improved it for 5 years. This migration exerted immense pressure on Native American lands. The federal policy shifted from relocation to forced assimilation. The Dawes Act of 1887 authorized the president to survey tribal land and divide it into allotments for individual Indians, effectively dismantling the tribal communal land system and opening the surplus land to white settlement. The symbolic end of resistance occurred at the Wounded Knee Massacre in December 1890. By the time of the 1890 census, the superintendent of the Census Bureau declared that there was no longer a discernible frontier line. As the domestic frontier closed, the nation looked outward. The doctrine of isolationism began to erode under the influence of naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued for sea power as the key to national greatness. This imperial impulse culminated in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Triggered by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, the conflict was brief, but the Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, transferred the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico from Spain to the United States. The Republic had legally transformed into an empire, entering the 20th century with overseas possessions and a booming industrial economy that rivaled the great powers of Europe.
The transition into the 20th century was marked by a fundamental shift in the relationship between the federal government and the economy. The assassination of President William McKinley in September 1901 brought Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. Roosevelt championed the progressive philosophy, which held that the government should act as a neutral arbiter between capital and labor. This administrative activism was codified in the Hepburn Act of 1906, which gave the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, the power to set maximum railroad rates. That same year, in response to Upton Sinclair's muckraking novel The Jungle, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, establishing federal regulatory oversight over consumer products and laying the groundwork for the future Food and Drug Administration, FDA. The zenith of legislative reform occurred under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. In 1913, two monumental structural changes were implemented. First, the ratification of the 16th Amendment in February authorized Congress to levy a federal income tax without apportioning it among the states. Second, the Federal Reserve Act, signed on the 23rd of December, created a central banking system consisting of 12 regional reserve banks to manage the nation's money supply and interest rates. This provided the elastic currency needed to stabilize the industrial economy. The Constitution itself was amended with unusual frequency during this era. The 17th Amendment, 1913, mandated the direct election of U.S. senators by popular vote, ending this election by state legislatures. The 18th Amendment, 1919, prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, a noble experiment, enforced by the Volstead Act. Finally, the 19th Amendment, 1920, guaranteed that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, concluding a 70-year legal campaign for women's suffrage. While domestic reform flourished, foreign entanglements loomed. When the Great War erupted in Europe in August 1914, President Wilson initially declared the United States neutral. However, unrestricted submarine warfare by the German Empire, notably the sinking of the RMS Lusitania and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, a diplomatic cable proposing a German-Mexican alliance, shifted administrative calculation. On the 2nd of April 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy. The American mobilization was a bureaucratic marvel. The Selective Service Act of 1917 instituted a national draft registering 24 million men.
The Industrial Wars Board, led by financier Bernard Baruch, coordinated industrial production, setting quotas and allocating raw materials. The war concluded with the armistice signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. President Wilson personally negotiated the Treaty of Versailles in Paris, incorporating his 14 points and the establishment of the League of Nations. However, the U.S. Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, refused to ratify the treaty or join the League, citing concerns over Article 10, which might compel American military intervention without congressional approval. The United States officially ended its state of war with Germany through the separate Knox-Porter Resolution in 1921. The decade that followed, known as the Roaring Twenties, was characterized by a retreat from progressivism and a return to normalcy, a term coined by President Warren Harding. Administrative policy focused on high tariffs, the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922, and tax cuts for corporations promoted by Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. It was also an era of restriction. The Immigration Act of 1924 established strict national origin quotas, severely limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. The economy boomed, driven by mass production techniques epitomized by Henry Ford's assembly line and the proliferation of consumer credit. By 1929, the stock market had reached dizzying heights, fueled by speculative margin trading. However, the structural foundations were weak. On the 29th of October, 1929, Black Tuesday, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Billions of dollars in paper wealth evaporated in hours. This financial event was not merely a market correction, it was the seismic trigger for a decade of social-economic despair that would fundamentally rewrite the social contract of the United States. The economic contraction that followed the crash of 1929 was unprecedented in its severity. By 1932, the gross national product had fallen by 40%, and the unemployment rate approached 25%. President Herbert Hoover attempted to address the crisis through the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised import duties to historic levels. The intent was to protect domestic industry, but the result was a retaliatory collapse in international trade. The crisis culminated in the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in November 1932. Roosevelt assumed office on the 4th of March 1933, declaring that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, before immediately initiating a frantic period of legislative activity known as the First 100 Days. The Roosevelt administration's strategy, termed the New Deal, was a series of federal programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. The first administrative action was the Emergency Banking Relief Act, passed on the 9th of March, which authorized the Treasury Department to inspect and reopen solvent banks. This was followed by the Glass-Steagall Act in June, which separated commercial from investment banking and established the Federal Banking Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to guarantee individual bank deposits. To manage the agricultural sector, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, was passed, introducing a system where the federal government paid farmers subsidies to reduce crop production, thereby artificially raising prices. The legislative infrastructure expanded with the creation of alphabet agencies. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed young men in forestry and conservation projects. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, was chartered to develop the economic infrastructure of the Tennessee Valley through hydroelectric dams. However, the most enduring legacy was the Social Security Act, signed on the 14th of August 1935. This act established a federal system of old age benefits, unemployment insurance, and aid for dependent children, funded by a payroll tax. It marked the permanent entry of the federal government into the social welfare of its citizens. Not all initiatives survived judicial review. In 1935, the Supreme Court ruled the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional in Schechter Poultry Corp. Versus United States, checking the expansion of executive power. While the domestic focus remained on economic recovery, geopolitical instability in Europe and Asia forced a reevaluation of foreign policy. Throughout the 1930s, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts to prevent U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts. However, as war erupted in Europe in 1939, policy shifted to cash and carry, allowing arms sales to belligerents who paid in cash and used their own ships. The decisive legislative shift occurred with the Lend-Lease Act, signed on the 11th of March 1941. This statute authorized the president to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of defense articles to any government whose defense was deemed vital to the United States. The U.S. had become the arsenal of democracy. The transition to active belligerence occurred on the 7th of December 1941, following the Imperial Japanese Navy attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Congress declared war the following day. The administration of the war required total economic mobilization. The War Production Board, WPB, was established in January 1942 to convert civilian industry to war production. The manufacture of automobiles was suspended. Factories produced tanks and aircraft instead. On the home front, civil liberties were curtailed by Executive Order 9066, signed on the 19th of February 1942, which authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. The war in Europe concluded on the 8th of May 1945, VE Day, following the unconditional surrender of Germany. However, President Roosevelt did not live to see it. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage on the 12th of April, succeeded by Harry Truman. The war in the Pacific was brought to an end by the culmination of the Manhattan Project, a secret research and development undertaking that produced the first nuclear weapons. Following the detonation of atomic bombs over Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August, Japan announced its surrender. The formal instrument of surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The post-war order was structured even before the conflict ended. At the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944 and the San Francisco Conference in 1945, the Charter for the United Nations was drafted. The United States, abandoning its former isolationism, became the first nation to ratify the UN Charter on August 8, 1945, permanently cementing its role as a global superpower in the emerging bipolar world order.
The post-war global architecture was defined by the ideological bifurcation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The administrative framework for this 45-year standoff was established by the National Security Act of 1947. This pivotal legislation reorganized the American defense and intelligence apparatus, creating the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, NSC, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Diplomat George Kennan's long telegram provided the intellectual basis for the policy of containment, which sought to prevent the expansion of Soviet influence. This was operationalized through the Truman Doctrine in 1947, offering military aid to Greece and Turkey, and the Marshall Plan in 1948, a massive economic recovery program for Western Europe designed to stabilize democratic markets. The Cold War turned kinetic on the Korean Peninsula in June 1950. The United States intervened under the auspices of a United Nations Security Council resolution characterizing the conflict not as a declared war, but as a police action. The conflict ended in an armistice on the 27th of July, 1953, stabilizing the border near the 38th parallel, a status quo that persists to this day. Domestically, the infrastructure of the nation was transformed by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. This statute authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways, justified constitutionally as a national defense necessity to facilitate troop movements. Simultaneously, the legal foundations of racial segregation were being dismantled. On the 17th of May, 1954, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, overturning the separate but equal doctrine of 1896. Enforcement, however, required executive intervention. In 1957, Eisenhower deployed federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce the desegregation of Central High School.
The legislative climax of the movement occurred under President Lyndon B. Johnson with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. The geopolitical competition extended into the cosmos. Following the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, the U.S. Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, creating NASA. This technocratic race culminated on the 20th of July, 1969, when the Apollo 11 mission successfully landed humans on the moon. However, the 1960s were also defined by the escalation in Vietnam. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president broad military authority without a formal declaration of war. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were deployed. The lack of a clear strategic objective and growing domestic dissent led to the eventual withdrawal of U.S. forces following the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. In response to the executive overreach during the conflict, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, attempting to reassert legislative check over the commitment of armed forces. The American political system faced its gravest constitutional stress test in the 1970s with the Watergate scandal. Investigations revealed a pattern of abuse of power by the Nixon administration, including the obstruction of justice. Facing certain impeachment by the House and conviction by the Senate, Richard Nixon became the first president to resign from office on the 9th of August, 1974. The 1980s witnessed a shift in economic policy under President Ronald Reagan, characterized by supply-side economics, tax cuts codified in the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, and deregulation. Foreign policy transitioned from détente to confrontation, followed by negotiation. Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, the first agreement to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. The external pressure, combined with internal Soviet stagnation, led to the collapse of the Communist bloc. The Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November, 1989. The Cold War formally concluded with the dissolution of the Soviet Union on the 25th of December, 1991, leaving the United States as the world's sole hegemon.
The dissolution of the Soviet Union left the United States as the undisputed global hegemon, a period initially characterized by a focus on international trade liberalization and the integration of global markets. This new order was tested almost immediately in the Persian Gulf. Following the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the United States led a 35-nation coalition in Operation Desert Storm. The combat phase, initiated in January 1991, was a demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority, concluding in just 42 days. The diplomatic focus then shifted to economics. On the 1st of January 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, came into force, creating a trilateral trade bloc between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, fundamentally reshaping the continent's supply chains. Domestically, the decade was defined by the rapid commercialization of the Internet. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was the first major overhaul of telecommunications law since 1934, designed to open up markets to competition and foster the deployment of new digital infrastructure. This legislative framework supported the dot-com boom, a period of massive capital investment in technology firms. Although the speculative bubble burst in early 2000, the physical architecture of the information age, fiber optic cables and server farms remained, altering the daily patterns of American life and commerce. The geopolitical trajectory of the 21st century was irrevocably altered on the 11th of September 2001. The coordinated terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon precipitated the most significant reorganization of the federal government since the Cold War. Congress passed the USA Patriot Act on the 26th of October 2001, expanding the surveillance capabilities of law enforcement. This was followed by the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which consolidated 22 distinct federal agencies into the new Department of Homeland Security. Externally, the United States initiated the War on Terror, leading to the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. These conflicts evolved into protracted counterinsurgency operations that would span 2 decades. The domestic economy faced a systemic failure in 2008. The collapse of the housing market, fueled by subprime mortgage lending and complex financial derivatives, led to the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers on the 15th of September. The resulting liquidity crisis threatened the global financial system. The federal response was the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, which created the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, to purchase toxic assets from financial institutions. Regulatory reform followed with the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in 2010, which introduced stress tests for banks and created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The political landscape underwent a demographic shift with the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the first African American to hold the office of the presidency. His administration's signature legislative achievement was the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or ACA, signed on the 23rd of March 2010. This statute mandated health insurance coverage and prohibited insurers from denying coverage based on pre-existing conditions, representing the largest expansion of the social safety net since the Great Society. The mid-2010s were characterized by the rise of social media platforms and the increasing polarization of political discourse. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 signaled a populist shift, challenging established norms of international trade and multilateral alliances. The United States briefly withdrew from the Paris Agreement on climate change and renegotiated NAFTA into the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. The decade concluded with a global biological crisis. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020 triggered an unprecedented shutdown of economic activity. The federal government responded with the CARES Act, signed on the 27th of March 2020, a $2.2 trillion economic stimulus package, the largest in U.S. history. The transition of power following the 2020 election was marked by the events of January 6, 2021 at the U.S. Capitol. This constitutional stress test resulted in the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act of 2022, which clarified the ceremonial role of the Vice President in the certification of electoral votes to prevent future ambiguities. As the nation approaches its semi-quintessential in 2026, the United States remains a complex federal republic of 50 states and various territories. From a fragile corporate charter in Jamestown to a superpower navigating the ethics of artificial intelligence and space exploration, the bureaucratic continuity of the American experiment endures, defined not by finality but by the perpetual amendment of its own laws.